Story number 1. My name is Harold, and today is a very special day. I'm celebrating my 36th birthday. However, amidst the joy, there is a small but disturbing piece of news that I will share with you soon. In my 36 years, I have found love and married a wonderful woman named Stella. We have been happily married for 6 years now, but before that, we just dated in the evenings for a few years. Stella is not only my wife, but also my first official girlfriend. Our paths crossed at one of our company's corporate events. Despite the fact that we worked in different divisions of the same company, holding different positions, fate brought us together. Stella is in production, and I am in marketing. Of course, before meeting Stella, I had previous relationships, courtship, and flirting. My first experience of love was quite unique. It all started during my high school years when I had a huge crush on our math teacher. Because of my deep admiration for her, I was even given the nickname the aged loser. In her classes, I couldn't eat, sleep, or concentrate. Every little thing about her, from her size to the way her hair fluttered, drove me crazy. I pondered for a while on how to make sense of it all. I finally mustered up the courage to talk to her one-on-one. I decided that the best option would be to sign up for tutoring with her, even though I was already good at math. Unfortunately, Lily, our teacher, was unaware of my abilities due to my frequent absences. After more than 10 classes in which I didn't pay attention to my lessons, but rather admired Lily, I found myself falling in love with her even more. I could no longer resist. At the age of 18, I realized I had to take the first step. Putting the textbook aside, I wrapped my arms around Lily's waist and pulled her closer for a kiss. Lily pulled away and gave me a lecture on maturity. It was clear she wasn't interested and avoided me for as long as possible, eventually transferring to another school. I didn't see her again until my 36th birthday. Fear and excitement overwhelmed me. When I saw her, my math teacher, Lily, standing on the doorstep of the house rented for my birthday party, I was speechless. I had completely forgotten where I was going and why. Stella introduced me with a twinkle in her eye to her mom, who had never been involved in our lives, not even at our wedding. "Harold, you have grown so much over the years, and now you look even more handsome." "I hope you've also gotten wiser," Lily said with a playful chuckle in her voice. All I could do was nod my head in response. "Stella, why didn't you ever mention her?" I asked, pushing my wife back to the corner, away from the guests. I couldn't shake off the feeling of resentment I felt toward her. How could it be that my first crush showed up on my doorstep on my 36th birthday? Throughout the evening, I managed to keep my emotions under control and act as if nothing terrible had happened. I didn't let my emotions and panic take over, even with my mother-in-law, who I was first introduced to, by my side. We decided to spend the night here, planning to clean up the house in the morning and return it to the owners. Not feeling ready for sleep, I picked up the bottle, poured the drink, and let my mind wander to the memories. "Why are you drinking alone?" "Mind if I join you?" asked Lily softly, approaching me. "Where's my wife?" I asked, looking around the room. "She's been asleep for a while now. Don't worry. I put her to bed, and I'll take you to her soon." Pouring another glass of wine each, we continued to chat and indulge in memories, losing track of time as the evening turned to night. Sharing stories of our school years, my heartaches, and Lily's travels, we drank and laughed. The next morning, I woke up in bed, but it wasn't my wife next to me, and I don't remember what happened. Thank you for listening to my story. Give it a like and comment if you enjoyed it. Goodbye. Story number 2. Such an unexpected turn of events in the story of my life took me by surprise. My name is Stephen. A year ago, I married Elizabeth, who is now my wife. She had to urgently leave town for a few days, and she mentioned that her mother would be staying with us to take care of me. Without thinking twice, I dropped Elizabeth off at the train station and went to pick up my mother-in-law. Why make her take public transportation when I have a car, right? Besides, if she treats me badly, she'll walk. I kid you not. Luckily, my mother-in-law and I have a great relationship. When she lived with us during our apartment remodel, she and I got along great, joking and hugging. Elizabeth didn't seem to mind at all. My mother-in-law lived about 25 kilometers away from us. I jumped in the car and followed her. Even though my mother-in-law was 23 years older than me, she looked amazing. She took meticulous care of herself and was in great shape. When I pulled up to her house, she was already waiting for me. We got back in the car and headed towards my house, talking animatedly, joking, and laughing. It dawned on me that as long as my wife wasn't around, I wouldn't be bored at home. On the way, we stopped at the store to buy something for the dinner my mother-in-law would prepare. Then we continued our leisurely drive through the heavy traffic on the highway. Suddenly, my mother-in-law announced that she needed to use the restroom. I immediately turned off the road, realizing that I needed to go too. There were bushes growing on the side of the road, and almost by accident, my mother-in-law and I headed toward them together. She walked ahead and I followed. Watching her, I couldn't help but admire her figure. She went to the left, and I went a little farther ahead. From my vantage point, I could see how my mother-in-law was absorbed in her business, completely oblivious to my presence. I, too, concentrated on my own business, furtively glancing at my mother-in-law. When she came out, she looked at me and stopped. I hastily averted my gaze, but she came over and said, "I noticed the way you were looking at me." "Don't be shy, my dear." I didn't expect it. Thus began our love story. We traveled deep into the forest where it all began. Later, we returned home. In the evening, while my mother-in-law was preparing dinner, we were having a drink. My attention was drawn to her short t-shirt. At night, history repeated itself, but in a more favorable environment than during the day. Our relationship with my mother-in-law had been going on for several months, and everything seemed fine. She didn't have a partner, and I was happy with that. However, all good things come to an end. One day my wife came home from work unexpectedly and caught us together with her mother. Naturally, yelling and a scuffle ensued. My wife scratched my face, and despite my mother-in-law's attempts to intervene, she was unable to prevent it. The mother-in-law also got slapped. This story did not end in divorce. My wife forgave us, and we continued to live in marriage to this day. Story number 3. My wife and I got married and enjoyed a happy life together for several years. Recently, however, I noticed a deterioration in our relationship. We were both busy with work. She would come home, have dinner, and go straight to bed without saying a word to me. This went on for a few months until I decided to investigate. I asked for help from a friend who used to work in a private detective agency, and he revealed the truth to me. It turned out that my wife had been seeing another man for a long time, which explained the tension in our relationship. I was furious when my wife came home from work and couldn't resist confronting her. The mother-in-law listened to everything but did not interfere in our arguments. Eventually, my wife called her sister, who lived in a spacious 2-story house with her husband and no children yet. She came and took my wife to her place, leaving me alone with my mother-in-law. She is a wise woman who immediately began to comfort me by telling me stories of her difficult life, including marriages and divorces. One husband drank heavily, and the other often came home smelling of women's perfume. Now, at age 45, she found herself alone. I finally understood her situation and reassured her by saying, "It's not your fault," after which I headed for the kitchen. I took a bottle of whiskey out of the refrigerator and set it on the table. I was followed by my mother-in-law, who decided to make herself a cup of coffee. Noticing the bottle, she offered to make sandwiches. I nodded and sat down at the table. She handed me a glass, and I asked if she wanted to keep me company. She replied that with a son-in-law like me, she would love to join in. She placed a second glass on the table, and I poured her a drink while she served the sandwiches. We sat together, enjoying our drinks and having various conversations. The whiskey didn't run out right away, and I switched to beer. My mother-in-law declined and left the kitchen to take a bath. I leisurely finished my bottle of beer. Soon, my mother-in-law returned to the kitchen now in her bathrobe and smelling of fragrant shower gel. She began clearing the table and moving around the kitchen. I watched her, finding pleasure in it. Unable to contain myself, I walked over to her while she was doing the dishes. I put my arm around her waist, and she turned her head and said, "You have a temper, son-in-law." I didn't let her say anything more, and we continued our warm encounter. Overwhelmed by desire, I fleetingly thought it was wrong, but quickly pushed the thought away. My mother-in-law was an attractive woman, and the whiskey loosened my inhibitions. We slowly made our way to the couch. What followed was intense and grown-uply intriguing, unlike anything I'd experienced before. Afterward, we lay there, completely exhausted and breathing heavily, like after a jog in the park. The sound of a key in the front door made us turn around abruptly. My cheating wife was standing there with a suitcase in her hands, shock written all over her face. "I came to pick up some things, but I see you've already moved in and are having fun," she hissed. Before I could answer anything, she turned on her heel and slammed the door behind her. I looked at my mother-in-law, and we were both stunned. "This shouldn't have happened," I said bluntly. She nodded, but there was a sly smile in her eyes, which scared me. We dressed quickly and avoided each other for the rest of the night. But I was still glad that my ex-wife had seen it all, and I was relieved to have revenge for her betrayal. In time, I wanted to continue to take revenge on her, but I pulled myself together and calmed down. She was not worth it. I just divorced that no good woman. By that time, she had moved on with a new lover. As for me, I went on casual dates, but had a hard time making real acquaintances. Eventually, I met a new person, and now we are engaged. This time around, I'm trying to treasure what I have. As for my mother-in-law, we remain good friends, but we keep our distance. The ghost of that mistake is always looming before my eyes. Although deep down, if I don't deceive myself, I liked everything that happened with my mother-in-law. Story number 4. Hi everyone. I want to tell the story of my life. I do not know how best to compose a wonderful narration, but I apologize in advance. Therefore, the story will be brief, but I will try not to leave out anything specific. One summer, my wife and I came to visit her parents. My father-in-law is a farmer who regularly disappears into the fields. He doesn't sit at home all day. But here's my mother-in-law, a beautiful 48-year-old lady with the physique of a 20-year-old girl. My wife asked for mashed potatoes and went to the store to get milk. I was alone with my mother-in-law. She strutted around the kitchen in a light robe, completely ignoring me. I had admired her for a long time. Mature, experienced, beautiful. We talked about nothing. Then she casually inquired how I was doing in bed with my wife. I was surprised by such a question, but didn't hesitate to answer. "Why don't you try it?" In response to my presumptuousness, my mother-in-law spun on her heels and grabbed a cutting board. But noticing my tense buddy, shorts very much pushed up, she put her weapon down. "Come on, since you're so brave." My second mom, who seemed to have abstained from sexual intercourse for a long time, led me by the hand into the room adjacent to the kitchen. Before I could even cross the threshold, she jumped on me, making my clothes fly apart. 10 minutes later, we were cleaned up and drinking coffee in the kitchen. My wife did not recognize anything. Fortunately, the store in that village is far away. And with my mother-in-law, we occasionally spend pleasant moments together. And she asks me to call her mom during our secret meetings. Our secret meetings with Karen's mother-in-law continued whenever my wife went away on business. We became bolder in our choice of places for dates, once even the tool shed came in handy for us in this endeavor while my father-in-law was busy in the field. The risk of being caught somehow made our liaisons even more intense and greedy on their own. Karen would meet me in tight, lightweight dresses with no underwear or see-through nightgowns, a feast for my hungry eyes. She taught me things I never realized were possible between a man and a woman, utilizing her flexibility in ways I was amazed. I was as insatiable as a young bull to her mature flower. She, in turn, seemed addicted to my youthful stamina, gladly wearing down a stallion half her age. We would fall together, drenched in sweat, and after a while, we would awaken to devour each other again until my wife returned. The game got more complicated when my wife started asking questions about why I was always mysteriously taking a nap during the day or going for a walk when she popped out of the house. One day she returned early and almost caught Karen and I lying on the living room floor. After that incident, Karen decided we needed to calm down a bit. But a week later, I found a provocative note under my pillow, signed with a lipstick kiss. Karen could not resist this forbidden fruit, just as I could not refrain from her generous offer. And so our seductive ritual continued at every opportunity. Sometimes minutes after my wife kisses me goodbye on her way out the door. The deception is intoxicating. We both know that makes it even hotter. Story number 5. This incident happened on Valentine's Day. My name is Peter. I am 24 years old, and I currently live with my wife and mother-in-law, in Chicago. That day, I went to my father-in-law's place of employment to borrow some money. To my surprise, I came across him hugging his secretary and kissing her neck. It was a scandalous moment, to say the least. I was shocked by his act, perplexed as to how he could betray his beautiful wife with someone as unattractive as his secretary. To get his attention, I slammed the door loudly. As soon as he noticed me, he quickly pulled away from the secretary and rushed toward me. He begged me not to tell my mother-in-law anything, but I just asked for the money I needed and left. I had my own plans for my mother-in-law at that moment, and my father-in-law was definitely not part of them. As I walked outside, I looked up at the sky and noticed that it was about to rain. Sighing, I slowly headed back into the house, immersed in my thoughts. I was so absorbed in the event I had witnessed in the office that I didn't notice anyone around me until I heard a familiar voice. It was my mother-in-law. She looked absolutely stunning in her outfit, and I couldn't help but admire her. Now let me introduce you to my mother-in-law. She is 43 years old and has a captivating beauty that any man dreams of. That day she was wearing a lovely short dress and elegant high-heeled shoes. She looked to be no more than 20 years old. "Dear mother-in-law, let's go to the park." "I would like to talk to you," I said, gently took her hand and led her towards the park. The mother-in-law followed me, clearly surprised by my request. She looked worried, thinking something was bothering me. Once we found a bench, I sat down and gestured for her to join me. "Look, your father-in-law cheated on you with your secretary." "I witnessed it firsthand," I said, looking her in the eye. Tears came to her eyes, and she hugged me tightly, seeking comfort. Naturally, I hugged her back. It was amazing how quickly she believed me, but it didn't matter. I didn't care about my father-in-law, because a wonderful woman like her deserved only the best. The clouds darkened, and it began to rain. Despite her soaked dress, I couldn't help but marvel at her beauty. She was simply stunning. I was completely blown away by her. "Let's go home, son-in-law," she said, rising from the bench. Slowly she headed towards the house, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. When I got home, I went straight to my room, as my wife was at work. I changed into dry clothes and headed to the bathroom, where my mother-in-law was just there. She came up to me and started undressing. Out of the blue, she said, "I want to get revenge on my ex-husband for hurting me." "Will you help me, son-in-law?" I was stunned by her offer. She looked at me, smiled and nodded as if giving me permission. I was confused, but I met her gaze, and she met mine. In that moment, we decided to fulfill our wishes, and it was a dream come true. 6 months have passed. My mother-in-law is divorced, and my wife and I are living with her. We have an incredible bond, and I hope it continues to grow. That's how, on Valentine's Day, I brought out my father-in-law who was cheating with his secretary. And most importantly, my dream came true. I played adult games with my mother-in-law, who I think is the most beautiful woman in the world. Her daughter is like 2 drops similar to her mother. But as for the bed, the mother-in-law, of course, in first place, my wife still need to learn a lot. Story number 6. Before you start watching the video, please show your support by liking and subscribing to the channel, my friends. At one of our parties, a friend of mine shared a personal story with me. She was sipping a glass of white wine away from our friends seated by the river. The story she told me concerned an incident from 2 years ago when she found out about her husband's affair with a young female coworker. She confessed that she had long been tormented by his behavior, although he denied it. Trying to find solace, she decided to cheat on him as well. The moment she realized the time was right came when we attended my son-in-law's father's birthday party. As I looked around at the people gathered, I realized it was the perfect opportunity. However, waiting for someone else to make a move was foolish, so she took matters into her own hands. She singled out a couple of men her age who had come without their wives and asked if they were single or if their wives just didn't come to the party. A few hours after the party started, her husband drank a lot of alcohol and almost fell asleep at the table. After taking him home to bed, I returned to the party and pretended to be a highly intoxicated woman dancing, singing, and partying to get attention. Following the saying, "A drunk woman is more likely to cheat," I hoped to attract the attention of men. However, after an hour, I realized that my efforts were no longer needed, as the 2 men I was targeting were in such a state that they needed to be carried home themselves. I was extremely frustrated, so I decided to go out into the yard and find solace on a bench. There was a holiday celebration going on at a house nearby, but my daughter was unable to attend. Sitting next to me was my son-in-law, who was smoking and complaining about the constant rain. He was also saying something about his wife, who was my daughter. I realized that he had just come from work. Since it was dark outside and the light from the veranda did not reach the bench, we could hardly be seen. He was very drunk and was talking nonstop, jumping from one topic to another. Suddenly, he mentioned how much he liked to see me having fun and how it turned him on. At that moment, I realized that at least one person had been invited into the house today who was paying attention to me, although I had no way of expecting it to be my son-in-law. I told him that he couldn't do that and what my daughter would think if she knew he wanted to play adult games with her mom. He responded by saying that love knows no age boundaries and that he has liked me for a long time. From then on, he never left my side, whether it was at the table, outside, in the yard, or even when I went to the bathroom. When everyone started to leave, he volunteered to walk me home. At my house, taking advantage of the darkness, he hugged and kissed me. We walked quietly into the yard, past the house where my husband was sleeping. We reached the barn where the horses were standing, and there he granted my long-awaited wish. When the climax of our encounter came, I sighed loudly, and at that moment, the horses roared. It was clear to them that I was enjoying myself. My son-in-law had given me the pleasure I had craved all evening, and perhaps for the rest of my life. A few days later, my son-in-law and I spoke on the phone and arranged to meet. We met secretly for several months, but eventually I initiated a breakup. I was embarrassed and felt ashamed in front of my daughter. Over the next few days, I agonized over my mistake, realizing that I had to admit it to my daughter. The weight of shame became more and more unbearable. Finally, one evening, as we were preparing dinner, I stammered and bowed my head and told her the whole sordid story. My daughter was instantly furious and upset, calling me every bad word possible through angry tears. I collapsed to my knees, begging for forgiveness. After seemingly endless screaming, she grabbed her bag and walked away, leaving me alone with my despair. The events that followed were excruciating. My daughter refused to see or speak to me for over a month. She made me sweat in uncertainty as to whether she had abandoned me for good. In the end, love won out. She agreed to try to reconcile for the sake of our family. I vowed to regain her trust. We still have difficult moments when she gets angry or resentful. But slowly, the healing process is taking place. I realize now how much I took our connection for granted, and I work hard every day to rebuild that relationship. As for Alex, I avoid all contact. One reckless act nearly ruined my life, a mistake I will never make again. By some grace, my daughter found the strength to give me another chance. I plan to spend every minute to prove that I can be the mom she deserves. Story number 7. Hi, I am a 30-year-old athletic guy who is happily married to a wonderful girl named Anna, who is 21 years old. However, let's turn our attention from young girls to my mother-in-law. It's pretty rare to have a favorite mother-in-law, especially when she's almost as young as my wife. I consider myself lucky to have such a beautiful mother-in-law who even surpasses my daughter in beauty. She may not be very tall, but she has a stunning figure with graceful curves. I must confess that thoughts of her visited me as I lay in bed. The furnishings in our house were quite interesting. I walked around in my underwear and my mother-in-law in her robe. In my mind, I always fantasized about talking to her about it, or at least hinting at it. One day, my wife went to a friend's house, leaving us alone in the apartment. It was a rare opportunity. I decided to relax a bit. I drank some beer, ate some potatoes and fish. For some reason, I bought a bottle of wine as well. When I got home, my mother-in-law had already gone to take a bath. She could splash around in it for hours. I retired to my room, turned on the TV, and opened a beer. I drank the first bottle quickly, as my throat was dry. As I was opening the second bottle, an idea hit me. While my mother-in-law was taking a bath, I decided to surprise her with a private party in the kitchen, being careful not to scare her. While she was in the bathroom, I carefully prepared everything, even finding a suitable romantic song. Then I called my mother-in-law through the door and invited her to join me in the kitchen for a chat. To my surprise, she walked past the kitchen and closed the door behind her. I waited, hoping she hadn't heard me. After a while, she finally entered the kitchen. My heart almost jumped out of my chest at the sight of her. With a surprised expression on her face and a smile on her face, my mother-in-law exclaimed, "What a delightful surprise!" I invited her to sit down, explaining that it was all for her. She accepted the invitation, although she looked pleasantly puzzled. As we drank numerous glasses of wine, I became increasingly brave and shared everything that was on my mind. My mother-in-law sat in a daze, but it wasn't long before she realized the situation. She was a wise woman. I poured her another glass and proposed a toast. "To us," exclaimed I. The wine seemed to have an effect on her. We both became more courageous. My mother-in-law smiled, gently placed her hand on my face, and that's when it all happened. A few weeks later, our secret trysts came to an end when my mother-in-law informed my wife and I that she was pregnant. To say I was surprised would be an understatement. I was in complete shock. And when my mother-in-law gave birth to her son, my wife was beyond thrilled to have a baby brother. I was happy too, not only because of the boy's arrival, but also because my wife still didn't know anything, and I hoped that would continue to be the case. As of the beginning of February 2024, my mother-in-law still has not told me who the father of the child is. She is silent and only smiles back. When he grows up, it will be seen who is the father of this beautiful boy who was named after me. Story number 8. I adored my wife for her temperament. She was not always easy to deal with and sometimes even difficult, but she was certainly a bright young woman. Ever since I met this energetic and resourceful woman, there hasn't been a dull moment in my life. We didn't just spend time lying in front of the TV. We often went on adventures, learned new things, experimented, argued, and even fought. My wife was always full of energy. Her ideas and creations were often bold and out of the box. I was often amazed not only by her imagination, but also by her boldness. Let me share with you one of her unexpected ideas. Just a month ago, my father-in-law celebrated a significant date, his 63rd birthday. Taking advantage of the pleasant summer weather, they decided to organize a celebration in a country house. Naturally, Janet and I were among about 20 guests. We arrived at my in-law's house early in the morning. My wife was immediately sent to the kitchen to prepare the food, while I was assigned various chores, both laborious and trifling. However, it would have been rude to refuse, especially on such a special occasion. After about 5 hours, Janet and I had already consumed a considerable amount of alcohol, so we eagerly headed to the river for a swim. As expected, my perky Janet swam around with almost no clothes on and teased me. When we reached the shore, I opened a bottle I had discreetly grabbed from my father-in-law's kitchen. My wife and I wasted no time, drank its contents, and proceeded to bask in the sun on the riverbank. My thoughts began to churn, but Janet surprised me again by interrupting my musings with a raise of her hand and hinting that tonight she wanted me to be constantly on edge. She had an idea, she said. I felt disappointed, since I knew that there would be older people here soon, and I didn't want to be on edge all the time. However, Janet assured me that she knew how to keep me interested. With those words, she took the dress and put it on. We returned to the house, where the guests soon began to arrive. No one tried to interrupt the festivities, and Janet and I continued to have fun. After all, it was an anniversary celebration. However, everyone couldn't help but notice the transformation of my mother-in-law, Elizabeth. She had been wearing an apron all day, but as the guests arrived, she changed into a rather revealing dress, showing off her age-inappropriate deep cleavage. All the men present were constantly paying attention to her, furtively casting glances at her coveted cleavage. She seemed to be purposely provoking them by laughing loudly and dancing. As I watched my mother-in-law and her daughter engage in similar and provocative behavior, I couldn't help but think that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. It seemed like they had completely lost control and their brakes had failed. My father-in-law scolded his spouse several times, and after an obviously raucous dance, went over to her and whispered something to her for about a minute. Finally, seeing the joyful expression on her face, he winked at her, prompting Elizabeth to quickly head toward the house. "Let's go," exclaimed Janet, immediately grabbing my hand. She pulled me to the far corner of the property, where the bedrooms of her father-in-law and mother-in-law were behind the fence. "Now you're about to witness a real spectacle," she said, noticing my puzzled expression. We quietly and carefully tipped 2 large barrels off the cart and climbed onto them from the outside, so that when Elizabeth turned on the light in her room, she wouldn't be able to see what was going on outside the window. She was, however, quite unaware of our presence. Undoubtedly, events would unfold as they had before. My wife's cryptic hints still remained incomprehensible to me. At the same time, without wasting time, my mother-in-law began to undress, throwing off everything. Soon my mother-in-law appeared before my eyes in all her glory, mesmerizing my eyes. But when I looked at Janet, I noticed a mischievous glint in her eyes. She was peeping at her own mother like an immature teenager, I thought, but I couldn't help but glance out the window myself. I was even more surprised when my mother-in-law pulled another dress out of the closet and effortlessly buttoned it from top to bottom all the way down the back. Fully dressed, she managed to squeeze into a black leather dress and then headed to the far corner of the lot behind the barn. She remembered her father whispering something in her ear, telling her what to do and where to go. They'd done this several times before, and I couldn't help but wonder if anyone had caught them doing it. It was a forbidden secret that strangely aroused me, even though I knew it was completely unacceptable. The situation clearly bothered her as well. However, what my wife said afterward took me by surprise. There was no way I expected to hear such words from a woman like her. "Let me distract my father, and you can go in his place," she suggested. I questioned how it could be done discreetly, but she assured me that she would show me how to do it. Janet pulled me back toward the corner of the lot. A shadow caught our attention. The woman's black dress was perfect camouflage on this dark, overcast night. Despite the loud shouts and music coming from all directions, the small barn was relatively quiet. Cautiously peeking around the corner, Janet invited me to follow her. Then she turned to me with a smile and whispered, "She's there, in the same pose as before. I'll distract Daddy. You have 10 minutes." Without thinking, my wife hurried to the set table, leaving me mesmerized as I reached my mother-in-law. She was standing leaning against a stack of firewood, and as she turned, I approached her from behind and gently placed my hand on her lower back. The mother-in-law snorted and mumbled, "David, finally." I'll try to act as a test, I thought. So I unzipped the zipper. The sensation was so unusual, and it excited me so much that I forgot about caution. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I uttered something. "Mark, is that you?" exclaimed my mother-in-law. "Hush, they might hear us." "David is coming now. Go away." This seemed to bother my mother-in-law the most right now. Nevertheless, she didn't change her posture. "No, Janet is distracting him." I parried briefly. That reassured my mother-in-law. Of course, we didn't make it in 10 minutes. But I guess my wife did her best. And my father-in-law was gone. When it was over, my mother-in-law remained standing there, unmoving. It seemed to me that she was upset and even resentful of me. But suddenly Elizabeth turned her head and said, "Come here again. In an hour." An hour. That's such an unusual story. If you liked it, write comments, put likes, subscribe to the channel. See you again.